$100,000 says this waitress can't understand a single word of Korean. The sentence cut through the ballroom so sharply that even the clinking crystal glasses seemed to pause. A few people laughed immediately. Others glanced around, waiting to see who would react first. Under the warm glow of imported chandeliers, surrounded by polished marble floors and tables dressed in white linen, Richard Whitmore leaned comfortably in his chair, enjoying every second of the attention. At 58 years old, the real estate millionaire had built a reputation for saying exactly what everyone else was afraid to say. Some called it confidence. Others called it arrogance. Tonight nobody challenged him. At least not yet. Near the edge of the room, Maya Brooks stood holding a silver tray filled with sparkling water glasses. Her black uniform was pressed neatly despite the long shift. Her name tag reflected a streak of golden light as she moved silently between guests. She had learned long ago that people often spoke freely around servers because they assumed nobody was listening. Or worse, because they assumed nobody serving them mattered. Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass and nodded toward Maya. "Come on," he said loudly enough for several tables to hear. "I'm serious. $100 grand. I bet she doesn't know one Korean word." More laughter followed. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The dinner was supposed to celebrate a multimillion-dollar partnership between American investors and several Korean technology executives visiting New York. The atmosphere had been elegant all evening. Until now. Maya kept her expression calm. She continued placing glasses onto the table without rushing, without reacting, without giving Richard the satisfaction he seemed to be looking for. Across the room, cameras from local business media quietly recorded portions of the event. Waiters moved carefully between tables. The scent of grilled salmon, garlic butter, and fresh herbs lingered in the air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath the darkness like a field of scattered diamonds. Richard smiled wider when Maya didn't answer. "See," he said, spreading his hands. "That silence just earned me $100,000. Several guests chuckled again. But not everyone. At the far end of the executive table sat an elderly Korean businessman named Professor Daniel Kong. Unlike the others, he wasn't smiling. His silver hair caught the light as he slowly lifted his eyes from the table and looked directly at Maya. Something about her face seemed to hold his attention longer than expected. Maya felt the gaze immediately. Not because it was hostile. Quite the opposite. Felt strangely familiar. She lowered her eyes and continued working, but a small knot tightened inside her chest. Professor Kong remained silent. Around him, conversations resumed. Richard was already moving on to another joke, another story, another opportunity to be the loudest voice in the room. Yet the older man never stopped watching Maya. Finally, one of the visiting executives leaned toward another guest and quietly spoke in Korean. The words were intended for a private conversation. No microphone, no audience, no translation. Just a simple observation shared between colleagues. But the moment the sentence left his lips, Maya's hand froze for the briefest second above a crystal glass. The executive noticed nothing. Richard noticed nothing. Most of the room remained completely unaware. Only Professor Kong saw it. And for the first time that evening, the elderly businessman sat forward in his chair. Because whatever had just been said in Korean, Maya Brooks had understood every word. Maya Brooks carefully set the final glass onto the table and continued walking as though nothing had happened, but inside, the words she had just heard echoed with perfect clarity. The executive had spoken quickly, assuming nobody around him would understand. He had commented that the waitress seemed invisible, the kind of person people passed every day without ever noticing. The irony almost made Maya smile. Invisible. She had spent most of her life hearing that message in one form or another. She moved past the ballroom doors and entered a quieter service corridor where the sounds of laughter faded behind polished walls. Stainless steel carts lined one side of the hallway. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. For a moment she paused and adjusted the silver bracelet resting beneath her sleeve. It was old and slightly worn, one of the few things she had kept from her grandfather. Most people who met Maya saw a server carrying trays. They never saw the years behind that uniform. They never saw the small apartment in Queens where she spent her mornings helping her grandmother organize medications before catching the subway. They never saw the stacks of language textbooks beside her bed or the handwritten notes filling dozens of notebooks. Years earlier, when other teenagers spent weekends at football games or shopping malls, Maya had spent hers sitting beside her grandfather, listening to stories that crossed oceans. Samuel Brooks had been a patient man with a calm voice and endless curiosity. He believed languages were more than words. He called them bridges. Every Saturday morning he would place 2 cups of tea on a small kitchen table and challenge Maya to learn something new. Korean became their favorite. At first it was simply an intellectual exercise. Then it became something much deeper. Maya learned grammar, pronunciation, history, and culture. She practiced until conversations felt natural. By 17 she could read Korean literature. By 20, she was studying advanced East Asian cultural programs at a respected university. Her professors often spoke about her future as if it were already written. Fellowships, international research, graduate opportunities overseas. Then life changed. Her grandmother became ill. Medical bills arrived faster than scholarship offers. 1 semester became 2. 2 became a leave of absence. Eventually Maya traded lecture halls for restaurant shifts and academic conferences for double shifts carrying trays. Yet she never abandoned learning. Even after 12-hour workdays, she continued studying late into the night beneath the soft glow of a second-hand lamp. Back in the ballroom, guests continued enjoying dessert while investment discussions drifted between English and Korean. Most of the room saw only status, titles, wealth, influence. Nobody noticed the woman quietly refilling water glasses possessed years of knowledge they would never imagine. Nobody except perhaps Professor Daniel Kong. As Maya returned carrying a fresh tray, she felt his eyes find her once again. This time there was no uncertainty in his expression, only recognition. Not recognition of her face, recognition of something else. Discipline, education, potential. The elderly professor slowly folded his hands together and listened as another executive began speaking in Korean. Maya remained silent, calm, professional. Yet the moment the conversation shifted toward the details of the partnership agreement, she heard a mistake so significant that her pulse immediately quickened. And suddenly, remaining invisible no longer seemed possible. The words settled heavily in Maya's mind as she approached the executive table once more. A subtle but critical misunderstanding had slipped into the discussion. It was the kind of mistake that rarely appeared dramatic at first glance. No raised voices, no flashing warnings. Just a quiet assumption that could alter the direction of a partnership worth millions of dollars. Maya placed a glass beside one of the investors and kept moving. Her heart beat slightly faster, but her face remained composed. Years of working in service had taught her how to hide reactions. People notice confidence. They notice mistakes. They rarely noticed restraint. Around the table, the Korean executives continued discussing future expansion plans. Their words flowed naturally between financial terminology and cultural references. Most of the American guests smiled politely without fully understanding the conversation. They depended entirely on summaries and translated highlights. That was where the problem had begun. One executive had interpreted a phrase as a commitment. Another had intended it as a possibility. In business, the difference between those two meanings could become very expensive. Maya lowered her eyes and continued serving. She told herself to stay quiet. It was not her meeting, not her responsibility, not her place. Yet the discomfort refused to leave. Across the room, Richard Whitmore appeared completely relaxed. He laughed with a group of investors and occasionally glanced toward Maya as though she were still part of his earlier joke. Every gesture radiated certainty. The certainty of a man accustomed to being heard whenever he spoke. Near him sat attorneys, consultants, and senior advisors. Highly educated people with impressive titles. People whose opinions carried weight. Maya knew exactly how this looked. A waitress interrupting a room filled with executives would sound ridiculous to most of them. The thought alone made her stomach tighten. Then Professor Daniel Kong quietly set down his fork. The small movement drew almost no attention, but Maya noticed it immediately. The elderly scholar looked toward the speaker currently explaining the agreement and listened carefully. His expression changed ever so slightly. A crease formed between his brows. He had heard it too. Maya felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. She was not imagining the problem. It was real. The professor slowly turned his gaze toward her again. For several seconds neither spoke. Neither moved. Yet something passed silently between them. An understanding. A question. A challenge. Did she trust what she knew? Did she trust herself enough to speak? The room continued buzzing with polite conversation. Crystal glasses reflected warm light across the white tablecloths. Waiters moved quietly in the background. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark sky. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt stable. Yet Maya knew that stability rested on a misunderstanding growing larger with every passing minute. One of the executives smiled and announced what he believed the agreement guaranteed. Several American investors nodded immediately. Richard raised his glass in approval. A few guests even began clapping lightly. Maya stopped beside the table. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray. Professor Kong leaned back in his chair and waited. The applause faded. Silence lingered for a brief moment. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, Maya took a slow breath and opened her mouth to speak. "Excuse me," Maya said softly. The single phrase was not loud, yet it carried across the sudden silence that followed the applause. Several heads turned immediately. A few guests looked confused. Others simply stared. Maya felt every eye in the ballroom settle on her at once. The silver tray in her hand suddenly seemed heavier. "I am sorry to interrupt," she continued, keeping her voice respectful and steady, "but I believe there may be a misunderstanding in the translation." The room froze. Richard Whitmore blinked once before letting out a short laugh. "A misunderstanding?" he asked. "In a room full of attorneys, consultants, and international executives?" A few guests smiled nervously. Maya nodded politely. "Yes, sir." Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. "And you noticed something all of them missed?" The question drew scattered chuckles around the table. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she remained calm. "I believe the phrase regarding future expansion rights was interpreted as a guaranteed commitment. However, the original wording describes a conditional possibility. The difference changes the obligation entirely." Several executives exchanged glances. One of the translators frowned and quickly reviewed his notes. Richard shook his head with a smile. "This is unbelievable." He lifted his glass and looked around the room. "Now the waitress is reviewing international contracts." More laughter followed. Not cruel laughter from everyone, but the kind people used when they felt uncomfortable and did not know what else to do. Maya lowered her eyes briefly. She had expected this reaction. What surprised her was that Professor Daniel Kong had not looked away. The elderly businessman continued watching her with complete attention. "Which phrase?" he asked calmly in Korean. The room instantly quieted. Maya answered in fluent Korean without hesitation. Her pronunciation was precise, natural, effortless. The effect was immediate. Several Korean executives straightened in their chairs. One nearly dropped his pen. Another slowly lowered his coffee cup. Richard's smile faded slightly. Maya repeated the sentence being discussed, and then carefully explained the contextual meaning behind it. She referenced the cultural nuance attached to the wording and why a direct translation could create a false expectation. Her voice remained composed throughout. No arrogance. No attempt to impress anyone. Just clarity. The translator quickly compared her explanation with the original document. His eyes widened. He flipped back several pages and checked again. Then a third time. Across the table, one of the attorneys reached for a copy of the agreement and began reading. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. The laughter disappeared completely. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Forks rested beside plates. Even the servers in the background slowed their movements. Richard sat forward now. The confidence that had filled his expression moments earlier was beginning to crack. "Is she correct?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. The attorney continued reviewing the document. The translator swallowed hard. Finally, one Korean executive nodded slowly. "She is correct," he said. "Very correct." A ripple of stunned silence moved through the room. Maya exhaled quietly. She had spoken because it was the right thing to do. Nothing more. Yet as Professor Kong looked at her with growing recognition, She realized the evening was only beginning to change. For several long seconds nobody spoke. The silence felt almost physical, settling over the ballroom like a heavy curtain. Richard Whitmore slowly lowered his glass onto the table. The confident grin that had dominated the evening was gone. In its place was something far less comfortable: uncertainty. Around him, executives began reviewing documents again. Pages turned. Notes were compared. Quiet conversations spread across the room. Maya remained standing beside the table, her tray held carefully against her side. She had not stepped forward seeking attention. She had simply answered a question. Yet suddenly she had become the center of a room filled with people far wealthier and more powerful than herself. One attorney cleared his throat. "The interpretation she provided is accurate," he admitted. "If we had finalized the agreement under the current wording, both parties could have walked away with completely different expectations." Another executive nodded. In agreement. The realization moved through the room one person at a time. What had seemed like a minor translation issue moments earlier was now revealing itself as a significant problem. A problem that could have damaged trust before the partnership had even begun. Richard shifted in his chair. "Fine," he said with a forced laugh. She caught one phrase. "That is impressive. I will give her that." His tone suggested he was trying to regain control of the moment. "But let us not pretend we suddenly have a world-class expert standing among us." Several guests glanced toward Maya. The comment hung awkwardly in the air. Maya could have responded. She could have defended herself. Instead, she simply lowered her eyes and remained silent. Professor Daniel Kong noticed immediately. The old scholar's expression softened. The restraint she showed impressed him far more than her language skills. Many people knew facts. Far fewer knew humility. Richard leaned back again. "Tell me something," he said. "Where exactly did you learn Korean?" The question sounded casual, but everyone in the room understood its purpose. He was looking for a way to reduce what had just happened, to make it smaller, easier to dismiss. Maya answered honestly. "My grandfather introduced me to the language when I was young. Later I studied Korean history, literature, and economics at university." A few eyebrows rose around the table. Richard blinked. "University?" "Yes, sir." "You studied this academically?" "For several years." The room grew quiet once more. Richard's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his glass. Before he could ask another question, Professor Kong spoke. His calm voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "Which university?" Maya turned toward him and answered. The moment the name left her lips, the professor froze. A memory flashed across his face. He sat forward slowly. "What year?" he asked. Maya gave the year. The professor's eyes widened. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion appeared in his expression. He looked at her more carefully now, studying her features as though searching through decades of memories. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the silver bracelet visible beneath her sleeve. The room remained silent. Maya felt her pulse quicken. She had no idea why the professor suddenly seemed so shaken. Across the table, several executives noticed it too. Professor Kong stood slowly from his chair. No one understood what was happening. Not Richard. Not the investors. Not even Maya herself. Then the elderly professor looked directly at her and asked a question in Korean that made her heart stop for a moment. "Maya Brooks," he said softly, "are you the same student who wrote the paper about cultural trust and international negotiations?" The question seemed to drain the sound from the entire ballroom. Maya stood motionless, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the silver tray. For a moment she wondered if she had heard him correctly. The memory reached across years she had almost convinced herself were gone. The paper. The late nights. The research library. The dream she once believed would define her future. Slowly she nodded. "Yes, sir," she answered in Korean. "I wrote that paper." Professor Daniel Kong closed his eyes briefly as if confirming something he could hardly believe. When he opened them again, they glistened beneath the chandelier light. "I knew it," he said softly. "I knew I recognized the way you spoke." Around the room, confusion spread across the faces of executives and investors. Richard Whitmore glanced from Maya to the professor and back again. "What exactly is happening?" he asked. Professor Kong turned toward the room. Several years ago, he said, I reviewed a research paper from an American student studying cultural trust in international business relationships. Out of hundreds of submissions from multiple countries, hers was the highest rated. A murmur moved through the crowd. Maya lowered her eyes. She had not thought about that achievement in years. Not because it was unimportant, because life had forced her attention elsewhere. The professor continued. The paper was brilliant. Not because it focused on contracts or profits. It focused on people. It explained why agreements succeed when respect exists before signatures do. The room remained silent. Several Korean executives exchanged surprised looks. One nodded slowly as though remembering the publication himself. Professor Kong looked back at Maya. You were invited to continue advanced research. I remember recommending your work personally. Maya swallowed carefully. I never attended, she said. My grandmother became sick. The answer was simple. Honest. Without self-pity. Yet somehow it carried more weight than a long explanation ever could. The professor understood immediately. So did several people listening. The old scholar glanced toward the bracelet beneath Maya's sleeve. Your grandfather gave that to you, did he not? Maya's eyes widened. Yes. A faint smile appeared on his face. He attended one of my lectures years ago. He spoke about you constantly. He said you would build bridges between people. Maya felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. She had not heard anyone mention her grandfather in a very long time. Across the table, even the attorneys had stopped reviewing documents. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody whispered. The room that had laughed at a waitress less than an hour earlier was now listening to every word she spoke. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan sparkled against the night sky. Inside, warm light reflected across crystal glasses and polished silver. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different now. Quieter. More thoughtful. Richard sat unusually still. The certainty that once surrounded him seemed to have disappeared entirely. Professor Kong finally looked around the ballroom and spoke with calm conviction. You are all impressed because she speaks Korean, he said. That is not the impressive part. He paused. The impressive part is that she had every reason to remain silent tonight and chose to help anyway. The professor's words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Nobody rushed to respond. Nobody reached for a phone or returned to a side conversation. The room remained suspended in a rare moment of reflection. Maya stood quietly beside the table, wishing the attention would move elsewhere. Recognition had never been her goal. She had only wanted to prevent a mistake. Yet the evening had unfolded in ways she never could have predicted. One of the Korean executives slowly rose from his chair. He was a respected technology founder whose company employed thousands of people across multiple countries. He looked directly at Maya before speaking in Korean. Professor Kong once shared portions of that paper with our leadership team, he said. At the time, we did not know the author's name. We only knew the ideas were exceptional. Several heads turned toward him. He continued, parts of our international partnership training program were influenced by those recommendations. Maya stared at him in disbelief. She remembered writing those pages in a crowded university library, fueled by cheap coffee and determination. She had never imagined the work had traveled beyond an academic review committee. The executive smiled warmly. You helped people without ever knowing it. A second executive stood. Then another. Each shared stories about negotiations, partnerships, and cultural programs that had benefited from principles remarkably similar to those Maya had described years ago. What began as surprise gradually transformed into admiration throughout the ballroom. Richard Whitmore sat silently through all of it. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Earlier in the evening, he had treated Maya as a source of entertainment. Now some of the most influential people in the room were discussing her ideas with genuine respect. The millionaire looked down at the untouched glass in front of him. For the first time that night, he seemed unsure what to say. Professor Kong noticed. Mr. Whitmore, he said gently, success often teaches us how to evaluate opportunities. It does not always teach us how to evaluate people. The statement was calm, respectful, yet it landed with remarkable force. Richard slowly nodded. No argument came. No joke followed. Across the ballroom, the warm lighting reflected off crystal and polished silver, but the atmosphere felt entirely different from the one that had existed an hour earlier. The room no longer saw a waitress carrying trays. They saw a person whose character had remained intact despite years of sacrifice, disappointment, and being overlooked. One by one, guests began standing from their chairs. Not because anyone instructed them to. Not because protocol demanded it. They stood out of respect. Maya's eyes widened as she looked around the room. Executives. Investors. Attorneys. Entrepreneurs. The same people who had barely noticed her presence when the evening began were now rising to their feet. The sound was soft at first. Chairs sliding backward. Jackets adjusting. Quiet movement. Then the entire ballroom was standing. Maya felt emotion tighten in her throat. She remembered her grandfather's voice telling her that knowledge mattered, but character mattered more. In that moment she finally understood what he had meant. And as she looked across the room filled with people standing in silence, she noticed Richard Whitmore slowly pushing back his own chair and rising to his feet as well. Richard Whitmore remained standing long after everyone else had settled into silence. The ballroom felt different now. The energy that had once revolved around status and influence had shifted toward something far simpler and far more powerful. Respect. Richard looked across the room at Maya. For several seconds he said nothing. The millionaire who always seemed to have an answer suddenly appeared to be searching for words. Finally, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. It was the pledge he had jokingly referenced earlier in the evening. The one connected to his public wager. The $100,000. He placed it carefully on the table between them. "A promise is a promise," he said quietly. Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled. The room understood that this was no longer about a bet. Maya glanced at the document but made no move toward it. Richard noticed. "You earned this," he continued. "More than earned it." Maya shook her head gently. "I did not speak tonight for money." The answer came without hesitation, without pride, without judgment. It was simply the truth. Richard lowered his eyes. That response seemed to affect him more than anything else that had happened all evening. Throughout his career he had met countless people eager for opportunities, recognition, or financial gain. Yet Maya stood before him with none of those motivations visible. She had protected people who had overlooked her. She had corrected a mistake that could have cost millions of dollars. She had done it while being treated as an outsider in a room filled with power. And she had asked for nothing in return. Professor Kong watched quietly from his chair. A faint smile touched his face. He had spent decades teaching students around the world. Every so often he encountered someone who embodied the lessons better than any textbook ever could. Maya was one of those rare people. Richard slowly picked up the document again. "Then tell me what should happen to it." The question surprised everyone. The room fell silent once more. Maya thought for a moment. Images flashed through her mind. University classrooms. Her grandfather's patient voice. Her grandmother sitting beside a window sorting medical bills. Students forced to leave school because life had become too expensive. She finally looked up. "There are talented students everywhere," she said softly. "Many of them never get the opportunity they deserve." Richard listened carefully. "Create a scholarship fund," Maya continued. "Help someone finish what they started." Several executives exchanged glances. Professor Kong nodded immediately. The suggestion felt perfectly consistent with everything they had learned about her. Richard looked at the document in his hand and then back at Maya. "A scholarship fund," he repeated. "In your name." Maya immediately shook her head. "No, sir." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" A gentle smile appeared on her face. "Because it was never about me." The answer settled over the room like warm light. No speech could have carried greater weight. No achievement could have revealed more character. For the second time that evening, many of the people present found themselves standing again, not because they were impressed by knowledge or language or accomplishment, but because they had just witnessed humility in its purest form. The evening gradually returned to motion, but nothing felt the same. Conversations resumed in softer voices. Executives exchanged business cards. Investors revisited discussions. Yet beneath every interaction lingered the memory of what had happened. Maya quietly returned the silver tray to a nearby service station and thanked one of her co-workers who had covered part of her responsibilities during the unexpected turn of events. She did not linger near the center of attention. She did not seek interviews, photographs, or recognition. That was never who she was. Near the ballroom entrance, Professor Daniel Kong approached her one final time. The elderly scholar extended both hands and gently held hers. "Your grandfather would be proud tonight," he said. Maya felt her throat tighten. For a moment she could not answer. She simply nodded. The professor smiled warmly and stepped away. Across the room, Richard Whitmore remained standing beside the scholarship agreement that would soon help students he would never meet. He watched Maya preparing to leave and slowly walked toward her. The millionaire looked older somehow. Not weaker. Just more thoughtful. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple. Genuine. Maya offered a small smile. "Take care of the students," she replied. Richard nodded. "I will." Neither said anything more. There was nothing left to prove. Outside, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Maya stepped inside alone. The doors closed, and the noise of the ballroom disappeared. For the first time all evening, she was surrounded by silence. Warm light reflected from the brushed steel walls. She looked down at the old bracelet beneath her sleeve and gently touched it with her fingertips. Memories returned like distant echoes. Her grandfather teaching her new words at a small kitchen table. Her grandmother encouraging her through difficult semesters. Long nights studying while wondering whether her dreams had slipped too far away. The elevator descended floor by floor. When the doors finally opened into the hotel lobby, the city waited beyond towering glass windows. Manhattan glowed beneath the night sky. Yellow taxi lights drifted through traffic. Reflections shimmered across rain-dark pavement. Maya stepped outside and inhaled the cool evening air. Behind her, 30 floors above, influential people continued discussing deals worth millions of dollars. Ahead of her stretched ordinary sidewalks, subway stations, and another workday waiting tomorrow. Yet something had changed. Not her job. Not her clothes. Not her circumstances. What had changed was invisible. The people who had overlooked her would never see the world quite the same way again. Maya adjusted her coat and began walking down the sidewalk. Her footsteps blended into the rhythm of the city. High above, lights glowed in countless windows. A gentle breeze moved through the streets. She never looked back at the hotel. She did not need to. The scholarship would help others move forward. The partnership would begin with trust instead of misunderstanding. And somewhere beyond the noise of the city, beyond wealth and titles and assumptions, the quiet dignity her grandfather once taught her continued lighting the path ahead. The night carried on. The traffic moved. The wind whispered between the buildings. And in that calm silence, justice needed no applause.